Hello, my name is Mitchell Elmore, and today I will be speaking about college students' judgment of a male or female defendant with and without an adverse childhood experiences score. So first, let's talk about the past research governing ACEs and juror information processing and behavior. So first thing we know about adverse childhood experiences and ACEs are that they're common and they come in many different forms. So what this means is most adults have some sort of identifiable singular event or childhood factor that affected them adversely as they got older. So this can be something as singular as personal injury, or it can be something as severe and pervasive as abuse, for instance. And these things are very common, which begs the question, how much does this affect the criminal justice system and how we treat them in the court of law? And ACEs can be quantified on a 0 to 9 scale, 0 being no ACEs present in the person's childhood, and 9 being a lot of ACEs present in the person's childhood. And we know that jurors construct a narrative framework with the evidence presented to them in court. So they hear evidence given to them by attorneys, and they piece it together and form almost like a story in their head where all the facts of the case fit together logically. And it has not been observed very extensively if ACEs fit into this narrative framework. And when jurors hold stereotypes, they cannot be impartial, especially in deliberations, because they're deciding whether or not to send somebody to prison. And it's impossible for them to completely tease out preconceived notions and biases that they had walking into the courtroom. So this is definitely something that needs to be observed in the context of ACEs, because if there is a stereotype there, this needs to be adjusted for in the court of law. So this is what led me to my hypothesis of if a group of participants read about a defendant whose ACEs score is known, then the likelihood that they will find that individual guilty will be different than for a group that reads the same information without an ACEs score. So essentially what this means is ACEs was taken as its own variable. And I wanted to see if that was what was hinging people's decision when they read a defendant narrative, which is just a write-up that I made, including the facts of a made-up case. And I had a non-directional approach to this because I didn't know if there was a bias and if it was for or against ACEs. So if they would be less or more likely to convict somebody based on ACEs. My participants were 76 undergrads enrolled in psych classes at ESU, with 15 males and 61 females, with an average age of about 18, with 55 freshmen, 14 sophomores, 4 juniors, and 3 seniors. They all had never served on a real jury before, and they were gathered from the PY 3030Z participant pool in Canvas. And my IRB number is at the bottom there. My materials were a pre-survey with 6 items. That included 4 demographic items and 2 past experience items. Those past experience items were gauging their experience in juries as well as their decision-making skills in the past, their confidence in them. My defendant narratives hinged upon my 2 IVs that I'll get to in my design section, but I had 4 of my narratives with gender and ACEs inclusion is being what they differ on. And I had a post-survey with 11 Likert scale items, with the first item being, I would find Alex guilty, and it had 10 other statements following it, and for each statement they had to rate how likely they would be to agree with that, 1 being strongly disagree, 7 being strongly agree. My design was a factorial completely between groups design experiment. I had 2 different IVs, each with 2 levels. The first independent variable was ACEs score, with 1 level being that they were present in the defendant narrative, and the other level being they were not present in the defendant narrative. The other IV was defendant gender, with 1 level being male, the other level being female. So what gave me my 4 defendant narratives is that I had 2 male defendant narratives, 1 with ACEs present and 1 with ACEs not present, and 2 female defendant narratives, 1 with ACEs present and 1 with ACEs not present. My dependent variable was the participants' verdict that they rendered in the post-survey in the first few questions. My procedure, this study was done using Qualtrics, as this was a remote semester and we had to do all of our studies remote. So Qualtrics is an online survey software, and it was set up to show each item in this order. First was the informed consent. Next was the pre-survey with the demographic and past experience items. Then random assignment was programmed into Qualtrics to make sure that each participant was put into different groups based on which defendant narrative they were going to read. So let's say they got female with aces present. So that would mean that they read the female with aces present narrative. Then after they read the narrative thoroughly, they did the post survey where they rendered their verdict and answered questions about how they decided. And then they were given the debriefing statement. Now let's get into the results, which is my favorite part. So this statement, I would find Alex guilty, was the first question in the post survey. And my participants rated on a Likert scale of 1 to 7 how much they agree with it. When it comes to descriptives, both female groups were fairly likely to convict the defendant with, it was almost 6 was out of 7 was the likelihood, the average likelihood. And with the male defendant, we saw similar numbers, although they were differing a little bit. Where this really becomes interesting is in the inferential stats. And I did a completely randomized factorial ANOVA post hoc test in which I found a significant main effect of ACEs with an F of 8.94 and an eta squared of 0.11 being a medium effect size. So what this means is ACEs was where they were hinging their decision. That was the operative factor in determining how likely they would be to find the defendant guilty, which is very interesting because that is what my hypothesis suggested, that there would be a difference. I did not find a significant main effect of gender, nor was there an interaction between ACEs and defendant gender. And this is about what I expected because I only had gender as an IV because I wanted to control for it, because picturing a male versus a female committing a crime is very psychologically charged. So I just wanted to make sure that it was separate from that. Now, when you express this graphically, you can really see the stark differences in the means, with the solid bars being when ACEs were known and the stripe bars being when ACEs were not known. And you can see when ACEs weren't known, they were much more likely to find the defendant guilty than if they were known, which provides evidence to suggest that maybe ACEs fits more into that framework that they build when they were reading the defendant narrative. The next results to one of the statements I want to unpack is Alex's childhood trauma played a significant role in how I ruled. In descriptives, we found that with females, with people who had a female defendant in their narrative, they were about middle of the road in terms of how much childhood trauma played a role, because it is important to note all defendant narratives included childhood trauma. It's just, it was whether or not an ACEs score was assigned was the independent variable, not whether childhood trauma was included. We saw about similar results with the male defendant narratives. And of course, just like the last one, it gets interesting with inferentials. So this was another completely randomized factorial ANOVA post hoc. And I found another significant main effect of ACEs with an F, a smaller F than the last one of 5.82 and a smaller eta squared of 0.08 being a small effect size. And what this means is, even though we have already found that ACEs was the defining factor in what they used to determine Alex's guilt, the defendant, they are unaware that that is what was going on. They don't think that trauma played a significant role in how they ruled, which is quite fascinating because that means that this problem is more insidious than I thought before, as people are not aware, my participants were not aware that childhood trauma was hinging their decision, even though it was. Again, I did not find a main effect of gender, nor was there an interaction between ACEs and defendant gender. So this is expressed graphically here as well. And as you can see, those that had ACEs in their study, they knew the ACEs score, they considered childhood trauma a lot more when they were deliberating than if ACEs was not known, which means that the ACEs score is more salient to them when they're building that narrative framework while they're reading the facts of the case, which is very fascinating because it means that having that number makes more sense to people, which is really worth noting. So what are the conclusions of this? Well, one is that my participants had stronger agreement with the statement about ACEs defendant being guilty regardless of the defendant's gender. And that this means that ACEs shows or that shows that ACEs scores carry certain connotations with people. People are more sympathetic to those with ACEs, according to my study. And they were more likely to say, yes, this person is guilty when they didn't have an ACEs score, which is quite interesting. Compared to past studies, as in Hilton in 2019, they found that a higher ACEs score was linked with higher criminal propensity, which is contrary to what I found, as this would suggest that there would be a bias against ACEs, that with somebody with ACEs would be more, they would be more likely to be convicted, which is the opposite of what I found. So it's interesting that even though higher ACEs scores are linked with criminal propensity, they're still not as, the bias isn't against them, which is interesting. And we also know from past experience that jurors have varying levels of confidence in their verdict, and it's unrealistic to expect them all to be just as confident in their decision as everybody else. And this is really important to consider, because when they're leaving the courtroom having just decided a case based on ACEs, you can't expect them, or any juror for that matter, to be fully confident in their decision. So, and it's because you're putting this huge decision in the hands of a human who is fallible. So the limitations, demographics, having done this study on college students, means that there's some limitations as far as demographics goes. Realism, it'd be great if there was a more realistic jury setting. My N size, of course, was small, only 76. I would like that to be bigger. Future research ideas. Authentic mock jury deliberations would be great. How does this differ when they're in groups? Studying this as an implicit bias because they don't know that this is there would be interesting to look at, as well as general attitudes towards ACEs, not just in the setting of a jury. So the bottom line is this finding exposes a potential flaw in criminal justice. ACEs do influence how people perceive a defendant, so this should be observed in order to properly prepare for it in criminal trials. So my references and my acknowledgements. So feel free to email me, and thank you so much for your time. Have a great day.